Let's just get right to it, because what happened today is one of those moments where you sit back, blink twice, and ask yourself, how is this even real? A federal judge has just warned explicitly, directly, and in writing of enormous consequences after throwing out Trump's hand-picked prosecutor because her appointment was unconstitutional. And before anyone shrugs this off as some procedural hiccup, let me be extremely clear. This is not a typo. This is not a clerical error. This is not some obscure footnote buried in legal code. This is the President of the United States installing a loyalist with zero prosecutorial experience to target his political enemies, and a federal judge just had to step in and say, absolutely not, this crosses the line. And honestly, it's jaw-dropping, because we've reached a point where a judge is forced to spell out in plain English a warning you'd normally reserve for a constitutional crisis. She's saying, if I don't shut this down, the entire justice system collapses. That's where we are. That's the level of corruption we're dealing with. A president so desperate to punish his perceived enemies, James Comey and Letitia James, that he literally replaced one interim U.S. attorney with another interim U.S. attorney because the first one refused to play along. And then he installed Lindsey Halligan, who had never prosecuted a case in her life, and told her point blank, get it done. Let that sink in. The entire criminal justice system, an institution built on independence, legitimacy, and guardrails, was bent into a pretzel so one man could use it as a personal revenge weapon. And it wasn't subtle. It wasn't discreet. It wasn't even competent. This wasn't even getting away with it. This was them saying the quiet part out loud and expecting the rest of us to just pretend this was normal.
But here's the part that takes this from reckless to outright absurd. Halligan was the only prosecutor who appeared in front of the grand jury, the only signature on the indictments, the only person in the room. She acted alone because the career prosecutors refused. Why? Because they'd already looked at the evidence and said, yeah, no, there's nothing here. And because Trump didn't like that answer, he ripped out the existing U.S. attorney and shoved in a loyalist whose sole qualification was loyalty. And the judge looked at that and said, no, this isn't how a constitutional democracy works. This isn't how the DOJ works. This isn't how justice works. If we allow this, there's no bottom. And for Trump's camp to turn around and act shocked that their unconstitutional stunt blew up in their faces? Give me a break. They didn't just cross a line, they bulldozed it. They didn't just test the limits, they obliterated them. If you're watching this and thinking, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, you're not alone. This is the kind of thing we used to warn about happening in collapsing democracies, not the United States. Yet here we are, a sitting president installed an illegal prosecutor to indict his enemies, and a federal judge had to physically pull the brake. And the worst part? This wasn't an isolated incident, not even close. And that's exactly where we need to go now, because once you strip away the noise, the theatrics, the press releases, and the spin, the actual forensic details of what happened here are even more outrageous. The devil isn't in the details, the entire demon is the details. And when you break them down line by line, the whole scheme falls apart so fast it's almost insulting.
Here's the reality Trump's team hoped you wouldn't notice. Lindsey Halligan was never legally in that job. Period. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 546, the law governing interim U.S. attorneys, you can only appoint an interim prosecutor once. One person, one 120-day term. After that, the appointment power shifts to the district court until the Senate confirms someone. That's the safeguard. That's the constitutional balance. And the reason it exists is obvious, to prevent exactly what Trump tried to do, install political loyalists without Senate oversight. So how did this all happen? How did an obviously unlawful appointment get far enough to indict James Comey and Letitia James? Because Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi attempted a legal sleight of hand that was so brazen, you almost wonder if they thought no one would actually read the statute. The Eastern District of Virginia had an interim U.S. attorney already, Eric Siebert, a career prosecutor, someone with experience. Someone who did not want to bring charges against Comey or James, because in his professional judgment, the evidence wasn't there. That was the first problem for Trump. The DOJ's own professionals didn't see crimes. So, naturally, instead of accepting reality, Trump decided reality was the problem. And in late September, Siebert was abruptly pushed out. Why? Because he wasn't willing to rubber stamp politically motivated indictments. And that's where everything goes off the rails. Pam Bondi, the attorney general acting more like Trump's personal fixer, immediately appointed Lindsey Halligan, a former Trump legal advisor with zero prosecutorial experience. Not minimal experience, not limited experience, zero. She had never led a prosecution. She had never supervised a federal criminal case. She had never presented evidence to a grand jury. Yet, suddenly, she was the U.S. attorney for one of the nation's most important districts.
Why her? The answer is not subtle. It's not hidden. It's not complicated. It's not even pretending to be. She was loyal. She was Trump's personal lawyer. She was willing to give him what he wanted, indictments of his political enemies. That was the entire job description. But here's the part the judge seized on, and it's the part Trump's legal team absolutely knew was unconstitutional. You cannot appoint a second interim U.S. attorney to replace a first interim U.S. attorney. Not unless the Senate confirms someone. That's the law. That's the guardrail. That's the entire structure. But Trump didn't care about the law. He cared about the outcome. So Bondi took Siebert out. She put Halligan in. She pretended to call it an interim appointment, and she hoped no one would notice. Except people did notice, because Halligan walked into the grand jury room and acted completely alone. No career prosecutors, no senior assistants, no deputies, just Halligan operating like a one-person political hit squad. She wasn't presenting overwhelming evidence. She was presenting Trump's grievances, and she did it fast because the statute of limitations in the Comey case was about to expire. That's why Comey was indicted mere days before the deadline. They rushed it, they forced it, and they did it with a prosecutor who wasn't legally authorized to be there. And then comes Judge Currie, a Clinton appointee, but more importantly, a meticulous legal mind. She did what prosecutors refused to do, what DOJ leadership refused to do, what Trump's own team refused to do. She opened the law and read it. She looked at the timeline. She looked at the appointment record. She looked at who signed the indictment. She looked at the statute, and she realized that what Trump and Bondi had done wasn't just sloppy, it was unlawful.
Her exact warning? That allowing this appointment to stand would mean the government could send any private citizen off the street, attorney or not, into the grand jury room to secure an indictment so long as the attorney general gives her approval after the fact. And she wrote that with emphasis, with purpose, with intent, because she understands something Trump either cannot grasp or simply doesn't care about. The moment you allow the executive to bypass Senate confirmation in judicial oversight, the entire separation of power system collapses. That's why she dismissed the cases without prejudice, not because the evidence is secretly strong, but because she didn't want Trump to claim she was permanently shielding his targets. She ruled on the law, not the politics. She gave DOJ the theoretical option to refile if they can get a legally appointed prosecutor, and if the statute of limitations still allows it. And spoiler alert, in Comey's case, that statute almost certainly doesn't allow it. They indicted him so late, so recklessly, that the clock has almost certainly expired. Halligan's invalid indictment does not toll the statute. That means Comey may be fully out of reach, legally untouchable, protected not by politics, but by the DOJ's own incompetence. And Letitia James, they could theoretically refile, but they need actual evidence. They need a real prosecutor. They need a clean process. And that's the part Trump hates. Real prosecutors don't play his games. Here's another detail the judge flagged, and this is where the forensic analysis gets brutal. Halligan didn't just sign the indictments, she was the only person presenting the cases. No supervisory attorney, no team, no oversight, no second pair of eyes. Why? Because career prosecutors had already called the cases baseless. This wasn't just political interference, this was political isolation, a deliberate attempt to cut out every institutional safeguard to push through indictments Trump wanted for optics.
Bondi's defense? She claimed the law was ambiguous. But here's the thing, it wasn't. Judge Aileen Cannon, yes, that Judge Cannon, had already dismissed a Trump indictment earlier over the exact same appointment issue involving Jack Smith's special counsel designation. The writing was on the wall. The argument was weak. They knew the law didn't support them. They did it anyway. And make no mistake, this wasn't incompetence. This was intentional. This was, we don't care if it's legal, we just need headlines. They wanted images of Comey and James indicted. They wanted Fox News chirons. They wanted tweets. They wanted sound bites. They wanted political theater dressed up as justice. And they thought no one would stop them, but someone did. Judge Currie didn't just dismiss the cases, she surgically dismantled the legal foundation they rested on. She explained why the appointment was unconstitutional. She explained why allowing it would obliterate the separation of powers. She explained why the indictments were tainted. She explained why Halligan's role was illegitimate. She explained why the DOJ's entire process had been corrupted. And if you're wondering why Trump and Bondi didn't anticipate this ruling, the answer is simple. They assumed the judge would be too afraid to challenge them. They assumed the judiciary would roll over. They assumed this country had become numb enough that no one would care how prosecutors were appointed as long as Trump got his revenge. They assumed wrong, because the judge not only threw the cases out, she highlighted explicitly that Trump's DOJ had been using similar unconfirmed loyalists in multiple districts: New Jersey, Nevada, California. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. And here's where everything snaps into focus. Because if this were a one-off event, if this were some isolated lapse in judgment, you could chalk it up to negligence or incompetence. But it isn't. It's a pattern, a long, unmistakable, well-documented pattern. This is not Trump accidentally misunderstanding the law. This is not the Justice Department misreading a statute. This is a deliberate, methodical strategy. Replace independent institutions with loyalists who will do what the law won't allow. And that's why Judge Currie's warning about enormous consequences hits differently. She's not warning about a single unlawful appointment. She's warning about the entire architecture of authoritarianism creeping into the Justice Department, district by district, prosecutor by prosecutor, until there's no one left inside the system who will say, this isn't legal. Because let's be extremely clear about what happened here. This administration has repeatedly tried to install politically loyal, unconfirmed loyalists into some of the most powerful prosecutorial offices in America. Not through Senate confirmation, not through statutory processes, through loopholes, improvisation, and brute force political pressure. Lindsey Halligan wasn't the beginning. She was the most dramatic example. But before her, Trump had already pushed similar maneuvers. Alina Habba installed in the District of New Jersey, Sigal Chattah placed in Nevada, Bilal Asaili in the Central District of California. In each case, the pattern was identical. Remove career prosecutors who resist political interference, then drop in a loyalist with minimal experience, no confirmation, and a clear directive: do the president's bidding. And let's pause here, because this is not normal. This is not something any president, Democrat or Republican, has ever done openly. Yes, presidents pick U.S. attorneys who align with their political philosophy. That's expected. But they still go through Senate confirmation. They still face oversight. They still must prove they're qualified. This, however, is something else entirely. Use interim appointments to bypass the Senate entirely. Then keep reappointing different interim prosecutors every time the 120-day clock runs out. Then order them to prosecute your enemies. Then pretend it's legitimate. It's not politics. It's not even corruption in the traditional sense. It's a direct attack on the concept of an independent justice system. Because once you normalize the idea that the president can use temporary appointments as a revolving door for political operatives, you destroy the only mechanism the Constitution gives us: Senate confirmation. You know who tried something similar? Not Obama, not Bush, not Clinton, not Reagan. The last time we saw a president try to weaponize interim appointments to bypass oversight was during the 19th century. And even then, it didn't look like this. Trump has taken a historically obscure loophole and turned it into a weapon. Let's walk through the pattern step by step. Step 1. Identify political enemies. Comey and Letitia James fit perfectly. Both had challenged him publicly. Both had opposed him. Both had criticized corruption. Step 2. Pressure the Justice Department to open investigations. Career prosecutors reviewed the evidence and refused to indict. Step 3. Remove the career prosecutors. Siebert said there was no case. Within days, he was gone. Step 4. Install loyalists using interim appointments. Halligan was hand-picked, not for her skill, but for her loyalty. Step 5. Push indictments through with zero institutional oversight. She walked into the grand jury alone. No team, no checks, no supervision.
Step 6, use those indictments as propaganda. The administration immediately portrayed them as proof that their enemies were criminals, even though the indictments themselves were legally defective. Step 7, hope no one challenges the appointment. This is the fatal flaw in the plan. They assumed no judge would risk the political fallout, except Judge Currie did.
And here's the truly alarming part. This wasn't just happening federally. Trump has been repeatedly signaling in speeches, interviews, and campaign rallies that he intends to weaponize the justice system as a tool for political revenge. He said it repeatedly, out loud. This is retribution. Biden will pay. We will go after them. They're not going after me. They're going after you, and I'm just in the way. Those aren't campaign slogans. Those are mission statements. And Lindsey Halligan's appointment wasn't the exception. It was the prototype. The Justice Department was being refitted in real time into a political enforcement arm. Look at the trigger points. When career employees resisted, they were fired or marginalized. When prosecutors wouldn't play along, they were replaced. When Senate confirmation would create scrutiny, they bypassed it. When the law blocked them, they pretended the law didn't exist. And this isn't hypothetical. We saw the same pattern during Trump's first term. He demanded the DOJ prosecute Hillary Clinton. He tried to force the DOJ to prosecute James Comey. He told Don McGahn to pressure the DOJ to go after Obama officials. He wanted the DOJ to seize voting machines. He tried to force Georgia officials to find votes. He wanted the DOJ to declare the election corrupt without evidence so he could do the rest. The pattern hasn't changed. It's just scaled up. It's accelerated. Now the people involved aren't fringe advisors, they are the prosecutors themselves. Judge Currie didn't just rule against Halligan. She pulled back the curtain on the entire strategy. She described in federal court a scenario where a president could theoretically send any private citizen off the street into a grand jury as long as the attorney general approved it after the fact.
Think about that. You could hire your personal lawyer, your business partner, your campaign manager, and make them an interim U.S. attorney. No confirmation, no oversight, no qualifications. And suddenly, they have the power to indict anyone you tell them to. Let that sink in. The power to indict, the power to arrest, the power to destroy lives, given to political loyalists with no legal basis. That is the pattern. And the scariest part, they almost got away with it. If Comey hadn't challenged the appointment, if James hadn't appealed, if Currie hadn't been appointed, if the case had landed before a different judge, if the statute had been read differently, if the timing had been slightly off, if even one variable shifted, these indictments would still be standing, Halligan would still be in power, and Trump would be pointing to those indictments every day as proof that his enemies are criminals. This isn't theoretical. It's not exaggerated. It's not speculative. This is precisely how authoritarian systems operate. You don't seize the justice system all at once. You chip away at it. You install loyalists. You push the boundaries. You break norms. You corrupt processes. You test judges. You push again. You see where no one pushes back, and then when someone finally does push back, as Judge Currie did, you call it biased, political, corrupt, a witch hunt, and you double down. This isn't politics. This is a pattern of authoritarian capture. And if you think Halligan was the last attempt, you're kidding yourself. This was a dry run.
And that brings us directly to the part nobody wants to talk about, but everyone desperately needs to understand: the stakes. Because this ruling isn't just about Lindsey Halligan. It's not just about James Comey. It's not just about Letitia James. This ruling is a flare shot in the sky, warning us that the justice system, our last line of defense against unchecked presidential power, is being tested in ways we have literally never seen in modern America. Judge Currie didn't write enormous consequences for drama. She wrote it because the consequences are real, because the consequences are immediate, and because the consequences are coming whether we choose to look at them or not. Let's be extremely clear about what this ruling really means. A president tried to install an unconstitutional prosecutor to indict his political enemies, and he will do it again unless he is stopped. That is the endgame. Not justice, not accountability, control. Control of prosecutors, control of the courts, control of who gets investigated and who gets protected,
control of which laws apply to whom. That is the prize. People think authoritarianism begins with tanks in the streets or generals on balconies. It doesn't. It begins with personnel. It begins with appointments. It begins quietly. Quiet appointments become quiet arrests, which become loud indictments, which become silenced opponents, which become government power used like a private security force. And Lindsey Halligan was that first step. Not because she is special or uniquely dangerous, but because of what she represented. A presidency testing the perimeter of the justice system to see how far it can bend. And here's the terrifying part. It almost worked. If this case had landed before a judge less willing to confront the administration, if Comey's lawyers hadn't flagged the appointment statute, if James hadn't filed her challenge in time, if the paperwork had been slightly different, we would be living in a country where a president successfully installed an illegal prosecutor, indicted 2 political enemies, and walked away claiming total victory. Now, imagine that becoming the blueprint for every future administration. Imagine every president declaring their own enemies criminals and handpicking prosecutors to prove it. Imagine a justice system where experience doesn't matter, qualifications don't matter, legality doesn't matter, loyalty is the only qualification. That's not a democracy. That's not a republic. That is the textbook definition of authoritarian power. And don't take my word for it, take Trump's. He has said it openly. This is retribution. They're not after me, they're after you. We will go after them when I'm back in power. He didn't just suggest weaponizing the justice system, he promised it. And Lindsey Halligan's appointment wasn't a misstep, it was a fulfillment of that promise. So when people say the system worked, slow down. Because yes, in this one instance, a judge stopped it. But the system didn't magically defend itself. One judge did, one case did, one team of lawyers did. And authoritarian systems don't fail all at once. They fail when the number of people willing to resist becomes smaller than the number of people willing to comply. And that is why this moment matters, because it raises the most important question of all. What happens next? What happens when this administration tries again? Because they will. Not because it's legal, but because they don't care about what's legal. They care about what's possible. And Halligan's appointment wasn't a misstep. It was a fulfillment of that promise.
Think about this. Halligan was put in place long enough to indict Comey and James. Her appointment was illegal the entire time, yet the indictments happened anyway. That should terrify every American who cares about the rule of law. It means illegal prosecutions can go forward before the courts catch up. Now imagine an administration that installs 50 Halligans at once. Imagine a DOJ where every critical office is run by an interim loyalist. Imagine a legal system where judges are overwhelmed with challenges while prosecutors rush indictments through like assembly line parts. That's what Judge Currie meant by enormous consequences. She wasn't describing a hypothetical, she was describing a trajectory. And the end of that trajectory is simple. A justice system where power flows downward from the president, not upward from the law. A justice system where the accused are determined by politics, not evidence. A justice system where loyalty is currency and law is optional. And if you think that's an exaggeration, ask yourself why Trump also pushed a mass purge of career civil servants, loyalty pledges from appointees, pressure on the DOJ to prosecute political critics, pressure on state officials to overturn elections, attacks on judges who rule against him, repeated demands to terminate parts of the Constitution. These aren't random. These aren't rhetorical. These are pieces of a plan. And Halligan's appointment was a key piece. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a warning. If the justice system doesn't continue to resist, it will be reshaped into something unrecognizable. The guardrails held this time, but barely. They held because one judge read the law, because one district had the right challenge, because the statute was clear enough to stop the abuse.
But the next attempt may be more subtle. It may be more sophisticated. It may involve different statutes, different personnel, different offices, and if even one of those attempts succeeds, the consequences will be irreversible.
because once the presidency gains the power to handpick prosecutors who exist solely to punish political enemies, the game is over. Democracy doesn't die with an explosion, it dies with administrative paperwork. That's the end game if this continues. A justice system hollowed out from the inside, replaced by loyalists, indifferent to law, answerable only to the president. And if you're watching this feeling angry or exhausted or scared, that's the point. You should feel something, because this isn't academic, this isn't distant, this isn't theoretical. This is happening right now, in courtrooms, in appointments, in sealed filings, in quiet firings, in rushed announcements, in backdoor decisions. The only question left is, will enough people push back before the guardrails break? Because once they do, there's no judge left to warn us about the consequences.